This is Take Notes with Jen Rafferty, where we move music education in new directions. I'm your host, Jen Rafferty, a music educator, author, and huge social science nerd, and I am so excited to go on this journey with you as we highlight the intersection between music education and the social sciences. Hello, welcome back to Take Notes. On this week's episode, I will be talking with Randy Ward, who started his career as a professional cello player for a number of orchestras throughout the Southeast United States, as well as the Washington Metropolitan Philharmonic. He earned a master's degree in music pedagogy and began teaching in Fairfax County in Washington, D.C. And now he is working on his Ph.D. at George Mason University with a focus on classism in beginning instrumental repertoire. One of the most important takeaways for me from our conversation was about the moments of meaning that we have often during our teaching career. And these moments are pivotal for us and truly shapes the way we move forward. So we talk about Randy's moment of meaning, as well as the importance of both culturally responsive teaching, as well as having cultural competence. Take a listen and take notes. So coming from a classical background, and your career up until that point, and then all of a sudden coming into this philosophical space about developing your own philosophy about how you teach music, what kind of things resonated with you? What kind of teaching philosophy did you establish at that time? And then how has that evolved since then?
You know, I had a really interesting experience in my undergrad where my applied teachers changed. I had three different applied teachers in my undergrad from three different walks of life, three different nationalities. So lots of different life experience and training from them, in which I had to start over I'm in my second year of study and I'm working on finger placement on the cello. Go completely back to the beginning. And fast forward then, almost 10 years later, and I'm working on a master's and I'm kind of grasping the philosophy behind these three different approaches. And then I end up in the elementary classroom and I feel really, really grateful for this experience because I have three different essentially tool bags for teaching beginning strings. So I spent a lot of time thinking about it after having done it myself before here I am in the classroom teaching it. Most teachers, they're pulling from their own experience as a student, what their teachers did throughout their grade school and secondary school, then what they were taught in their undergraduate music ed coursework, from your instrumental methods text and from your classes. Then you show up, you get your job, you go on your first day, and you've kind of got your set resource that you take into the room in your first year. Whereas I didn't have, obviously I was a student and had my teachers that I pulled from, but then I also had this, I had this long performing career and then this philosophical approach in my graduate training. And so I feel like I had a frame of mind where I was able to take this philosophical mindset to the different ways that I had learned to teach the content that I had delivered to me. And so I got to kind of shop from a menu as I went into the classroom for my first year. And I was much older than most first year teachers and had all kinds of other life experience. But I had kind of a catalog to choose from when I was deciding how I was going to teach finger placement or how I was going to teach bow hold. I didn't have my one way that I kind of prescribed to students. I had several different ways that I could use to differentiate my instruction or find ways to communicate with an individual student that wasn't understanding what I was trying to teach.
And that's all really valuable. I think you're right that first year teachers or even just beginner teachers, while, pre-service programs try to cram as much as they possibly can into those 4 years or so, it's never enough it's just never enough, because the default, I think you're right, is to go back to the way that you were taught. And then, secondarily, what you learned in your college programming. And then if that's all you have, that's all you have to give, that's all you have to offer. So that's I think really valuable information from you to just have a perspective of, expanding your breadth of options, or a menu, as you said.
Yeah, I had a great opportunity this year at George Mason to help. We set up they do lab ensembles in regular non-COVID withstanding years for students or pre-service teachers to get experience on secondary instruments or disciplines. So for example, you'd have a band where your clarinet section has vocal majors, string majors, percussion majors, and then your trumpet section has the same reflection of student population. So they weren't able to do that because there were no live rehearsals. So instead, they had a lecture series of kind of things you probably wish or didn't know you needed to know before going into the classroom for pre-service music ed students. And it was awesome. I got to present there about positionality, how to be reflective to maximize your own teaching. And there were 8 or 9 other tremendous guests on that series. So that was an awesome way that I got to help give back on that directly.
Yeah, pre-service teachers and first-year teachers need so much support. You kind of go out there, ready to go, and then you get into your classroom and you're kind of like, oh, I don't know, there's so much I didn't learn. And in that moment, I think a lot of people internalize that. And I think that's why we lose a lot of teachers, especially at the beginning, because they weren't prepared. I wasn't prepared for a lot of the challenges that I faced. And I certainly overcame those obstacles, but it's hard. And especially being a music teacher, sometimes you feel like you're on an island. You're the only one there,
And you really are. Once when you're going into the room, there's no way to communicate to someone who hasn't stood up in front of the classroom. That's why student teaching is so invaluable. But until you're actually there and you have the faces looking at you and reacting to every word, every motion, every expression, everything that you're doing, there's no way to conceive what it's like standing up in front of an ensemble or in front of a classroom.
Yeah, 100%. So those things that you learned and the way you're able to use them in your classroom, you kind of develop this philosophy. And from the conversations that we had prior to this, you've kind of alluded to, when you got into this classroom ready to go with your philosophy, you kind of also had one of those moments where the things that you thought you were prepared for ended up being that you prepared for maybe a different scenario. And then here you were in this scenario. So talk about that a little bit. How did that happen? What was your, realization? And then how did you overcome that?
Yeah. So nonetheless, I feel like I had this great resource of strategies, and there I was, deer in the headlights in front of a classroom. So I think it was in my first year of teaching. It may have been in my second. I was doing a lesson for 4th grade beginning strings, and we were several months into the year. We had done all of the introductory stuff. They were good with their left hand positioning and all of that, and we were starting to use the bow a little bit. And so I teach beginning, I've always taught beginning bow by rote. I have a big background in Suzuki, and I think the listening is the most important thing, especially in string playing, because you have to have a grasp on the characteristic sound. So I come into this lesson prepared to teach Mary Had a Little Lamb. It's like, okay, this is my standard 3-note by rote song. It's going to be great. And I start playing, and I've introduced the activity. We've done warm-ups. I start playing, and the kids are just giving me that, looking at me like, what are you doing? What is this? What's going on right now? And it's like, Mary Had a Little Lamb. And they're like, what's that? Or ¿Qué es eso? And so this classroom population was largely Hispanic speaking, primarily. Also, many other nationalities, many Arabic speaking students, of an array of African nations represented in this classroom. probably less than 10% native English speakers. And these kids just didn't know Mary Had a Little Lamb. So the whole point was to be using a song that they had known for essentially a lifetime, where that they could be drawing on prior knowledge and just be focusing on the sound produced on the instrument. And if they didn't play an F sharp, they would immediately know, because they know what it's supposed to sound like within the context of the song. So that lesson was a total derailment. And I like to think that there are teachers out there that haven't had these experiences, but I know in my heart of hearts that everyone has this happen at some point. And you just have to throw the book out of the window and don't cry in front of the students. Hold it together until after that lesson and regroup and come back at it next time. It's just one of those things that happens.
So what a gift you were able to have in that moment. I'm sure in that moment you probably didn't interpret it as a gift. And, now that we're older and wiser, you can look back and be like, oh wow, okay, that was this beautiful moment of perspective and putting me in check of where I'm coming from and my lived experiences and how that is different from the students' lived experiences. So then moving forward from that, after the crying, how did you use that experience to then shape what happened next in your classroom?
So if I had to pinpoint one experience, one formidable experience in my teaching career for the long term, that's the one. And all of the research that I'm doing now, I feel like the genesis was in that moment. And in all of my research and work right now, it's like, what can be done to help a teacher that is in that moment? So I've been directing my focus on what can be provided to teachers in that moment to give them support. And the issue here is strictly the repertoire in my eyes. The repertoire that is presented, you get your budget, you buy your book, you have $8 per student maybe, and you get your essential elements if you're a strings or band director or something comparable. And then that's the repertoire you have to communicate to the students. But that's kind of stuck in like the 1970s at best. And the community where I'm teaching, or I was teaching in Fairfax County, is reflective of a really, really diverse community. And that method is just not as effective as it's intended to be. So what if I had at my fingertips a resource that could provide three pitch quarter note song comparable to Mary Had a Little Lamb from like a Spanish children's song. Maybe this population is Colombian, El Salvadorian, and Mexican, and maybe this song that I have still wouldn't be effective because it's Venezuelan. But what could teachers have to access content that would help in that situation is kind of what I'm hoping to focus on in my research and professional work down the line.
What I find so inspiring about your story is that you took that moment and instead of hiding and shying away from it because it was uncomfortable and something you didn't know about, not only did you lean in, but you got so curious about it. You found this huge gap in the music education field that really needs a huge bridge, because you're right. Those books are very based in that, white Eurocentric paradigm. And I've heard literally from every single person I speak to on this podcast, you use the word reflection. The things that we do in the classroom should be reflective of the kids who are right in front of you. If they don't see themselves in the lesson, like, what are we doing?
Yeah, I was reading a really interesting article just this morning about research that was done. I'm sorry, I can't recall who the researcher was, but it was about interviewing students that had hip hop centered music instruction for I don't know if it was a term or for a quarter or a unit, whatever. But they were interviewing the students about the teacher. And so the school had this big initiative to, have better representative instruction. And the students, largely African American, the teacher was white male, and the students are like, this guy has no idea what he's talking about. We appreciate that he's trying, but this is pointless, was essentially the sentiment from the students. So there's all kinds of initiatives of CRE with being culturally responsive, and which is really, really important. But to me, that's a couple steps down the line. We have to have an understanding of cultural competence where we're able to communicate with students of a different race or gender or whatever cultural background you choose to identify. It has to be there before you can start instilling policy in the classroom. So I feel like we got to take a step back before really digging in on that approach.
I think that example that you just showed highlights that, where it's like, oh, well, here's like this really low hanging piece of fruit that I can just like take and put in my classroom, but you're not actually doing the thing. You're doing the thing so you can like check a box and be like, see everyone, I'm doing the thing. And right. Culturally diverse programming is also not the same as cultural competence. And so I want to know a little bit about that in your words. Like, really, what is cultural competence? And I know you kind of like gave an overview, and then how is that different than culturally responsive teaching?
Sure. So being culturally competent is just the ability to communicate and understand from cultures other than your own, both simply. So whatever your position is, for me, I'm a cisgendered Catholic father of two living in the suburbs. And so I have to accept what that is and what that means for me and what that may mean to students, whether I communicate all of this information to them or not. It's part of who I am, and it's going to be part of my, whatever relationships I have with students and colleagues. So with that knowledge, I have to be understanding of my life experience, the student's life experience, and what is to happen between us because of that, or in my instructional delivery method, which is what the culturally responsive education has to do with. So I see being culturally responsive as accountability for teachers being culturally competent in their instruction. And I guess that's kind of, in a nutshell, where I delineate cultural competence and culturally responsive education.
I love that you use the word accountability, because that is a piece that is important in every type of policy or protocol that we create. And it's like, okay, great, we're doing this thing now, but then how do we hold ourselves accountable? And I think that is a really nice way of putting both of those things. You have the competence is that there's that understanding, and then the actual teaching part is the accountability of it. And also, I think what I'm hearing you say, and I have to agree, is that cultural competence isn't about just what's in front of you, but it's about looking inward to yourself and understanding who you are as an individual and in connection with all of the people that you are working with or around, or go to the store or whatever. And then that relationship between.
And going back to pre-service teachers, the practice of reflection is drilled home. But that reflection is about your lesson planning and about your classroom management. Being an educator, a lot of emotion is invested into your students, into your career, into your colleagues, into your lessons, into everything. And you have to be reflective of yourself as well. And especially when you're a teacher, because you are molding the minds of the future, to throw out cliches, but it really is true. And you have to be authentic to who you are, be authentic to who they are, and be respectful of any differences, and just to ensure that you're helping to teach students how to be good people. And by being reflective of reflective of your own cultural competence, and understanding what happens in the classroom, like my experience where my students didn't know Mary Had a Little Lamb and looked at me with blank eyes. In those moments, you have a choice to either crumble or make yourself better. And you hopefully are able, in a position that you're being reflective, to make a good choice.
So I want to go back to your story then. How were you able to be reflective, and how did that initiate change in your approaches in the classroom?
So it took a long time. It ultimately took several years to complete. I'll say complete the reflection. We never complete our reflection, but so in the moment, I was itinerant between 3 schools, and this particular experience was at a school that was 0.1% of my, or 10% of my contract hours. So, I go teach at 2 other schools where I had essentially 200 of my students. And then I go back to this one school where I have 20 of my students. And it was like I was up at night thinking about this. I was in front of students at another school trying to teach and thinking about this. Like I couldn't get it out of my mind. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what support to look for or who to talk to. I talked to teachers that had been in that school in the past. And sadly, the attitude a lot was, oh, well, that's just that school. So, so I was on my own. And that journey took a long time. But ultimately, I decided that the issue is the content from the being in the classroom perspective. And I didn't understand going into that classroom who these students were. It was early in the school year, and I was itinerant again between multiple schools. So it was really hard to make the personal connection with the kids. And I realized that I hadn't done that. There weren't resources to support. And then that's where this kind of perfect storm disaster happened.
I think one of the obstacles for teachers, and maybe, it sounds like this was an easy transition for you, but being from you're having your training being in this classical genre, there, at least for me and for the people that I've been speaking with, there's like this stigma and like classism that goes along with, oh, well, this music is elite, this music is the correct music, and pop music is like this low level, like garbage. We don't want to teach that in the classroom because of this, that, or the other. And that perception, I remember being explicitly told that in my undergrad programs, like you don't put pop music on your programs, that's bad. And so how, and maybe it was just natural, maybe because you were older, and you had more lived experience at this point where this happened. Did you have any kind of reckoning that needed to happen internally for you to be like, oh, no, I know I was told this, but like, this is really what's correct?
Honestly, I didn't have to have a reckoning, because at my core, as a toddler, my mom was a sound engineer for a bluegrass band. So I was around bluegrass concerts. I went to a really diverse high school. And as a teenager, I was really into hip hop. And I was into classic rock. And then, and as a middle schooler, I got detention for playing Metallica Enter Sandman out of turn in my orchestra class. Like, I am not the classical mold. And when I was working in performance, and I did some cool internships in New York City and all this kind of stuff, I realized I was like, this is my thing, but I'm not sure these are my people. So maybe that's the reckoning that I had. So I was like, well, I'm in, this is what I do. How, where do I find this balance? And so the the classism that you were speaking of, it's absolutely there. I can't imagine anything less accessible than classical music. It's held on a pedestal for sure. You put it in fancy concert halls with tuxedos on and concert gowns, and tickets are outrageously expensive. It's not accessible at all. And to hear music from 300 years ago that, younger people now have no idea what it is. So it doesn't have to be Mary Had a Little Lamb to foster excitement for music. Whatever is exciting for that student is what's going to create excitement for the music, and the instrument or choir or whatever. So I've made it my goal to just create that energy for music, regardless of discipline. So maybe you have a classroom full of Mozart enthusiasts, and and Twinkle Twinkle is the best thing that ever happened to them. And that with that community, that's perfect. I don't think that's going to happen very often, but maybe for Twinkle Twinkle, maybe not anything else. But if you hand a child a clarinet, or you hand a child a trumpet or a violin and expect them to like it, when you're trying to teach them music that's not accessible to them, it's probably not going to happen for the majority of them. So you just essentially teach musicianship and music that they want to know. And then later on, you can get into the history, and maybe 6 years down the road, you can start digging into Beethoven or Mozart, Bach, with a student that already is in love with the instrument or the discipline that they've chosen. So you don't have to jump right into history. Nobody jumps right into history in any discipline. So we can save it too.
And again, it's teaching the person that's in front of you.
Absolutely. And it doesn't take much work to get any, just kind of snippet of knowledge about a student. To start the year with my first year students, I had them make their own name tags and draw pictures and write messages and whatever. So even if there's a kid that, I've seen one time, he drew a picture of LeBron James on his name tag, and I knew that this kid liked LeBron James and liked basketball. So I could make a basketball joke with this student without having a single conversation with them. They're like, "Wow, how do you know I like basketball?" I was like, "Get your name tag." So any way that you can make any kind of connection with the kids at all will help to maximize that experience for sure.
It always comes down to connection and building relationships, doesn't it? And the more we take the time to really know our students, the more they will see themselves reflected in your lessons, and your impact will be that much greater. If you want to know more about Randy and his work, you can reach him on LinkedIn or email him at randycello@gmail.com. The links will be in the podcast notes. Until next time, this is Jen Rafferty. Have a wonderful day. This podcast was brought to you by Jen Rafferty Music, cover art by Molly Reagan and Good Neighbor Art, and music by John Kiefner.